Good morning, everyone. Trying to get myself sorted out here. It's early, so my contacts aren't focused, so hopefully by the time I'm done, everything will be clear. I'm really grateful that you came out to listen to me this early. And first, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of the land, this land that we're on, and to honor the local indigenous people of this land, the local indigenous community, the Lenape Nation, Oneida Nation, and the Chippewa of the Thames. Also want to honor indigenous people in urban areas and honor indigenous people all over Canada, all over this place we call Canada. Canada look forward to celebrating its 150 years. That's coming up. There's a lot of things going around about 150 years. So it's important for us to understand, and a lot of indigenous scholars remind us that the land we're on is much, much older than 150 years, and the people as well. Both the land and the people are connected, and they've been here since time immemorial. So this is one of the central themes in my presentation today as well. And I'm very excited to be here today, and I actually want to thank the organizers for bringing all of us together. So you guys did a really great job. I didn't know Dr. Macmillan, but I think that when I was asked to speak and I saw this theme this year, and if anyone knows me, I love titles, right, Megan? And I really love this title. I think it's a beautiful theme, one that speaks well to the legacy of Dr. Macmillan, even though I didn't know him. And I think it's a theme that honors his memory. So I congratulate the organizers, and I'd like to congratulate all the grad students and everyone who has put this together. And I want to thank you for the work that you do here at the faculty, the research work that you do. So my presentation, and I will tell you, Jenny, when to do the slides. So my presentation and my research was funded by Athabasca University back in 2013. I received a grant to do this research. And it looks at oh, by the way, before I say that, I went through their ethics review, and I also, because it was international, I went through ethics review in the community where I was doing the research as well with 3 elders. And so it looks at the complexities of identities. When we talk about identities, it's very, very complex. And the shifts and the tensions which the history and impact brought about in the Caribbean context. So when we look at the history, no matter how discomforting, I can't say that word, it sounds or it is for us, we really have to look at history. We have to look at the historicity to understand contemporary context, contemporary experiences of why things are the way they are today. So I'm looking at experiential knowledges, life histories that are embodied within a decolonizing framework, within an indigenous framework. And despite 500 plus years, so as you see there before 1492, despite 500 years plus of historical process, the Taino people, which I'll explain to you who they are, and other indigenous people of the Caribbean have remained rooted in who they are as a people. And that speaks to the theme that you see there before 1492, indigenous and still here. So I think it's important for me to also honor my ancestors, because I think that they're symbolic of why I'm here with you today. So can I, the other slide, let's see how that looks. So it didn't really look too, yeah, it doesn't show up too nicely on the PowerPoint, but as you see, I am originally from Jamaica, and I don't know if anybody can tell which one that is on the map. It doesn't say. What that map represents is the Greater Antilles, and it shows the very, very original name in their language that indigenous people all over the Caribbean had for themselves before contact. Can anybody tell which one is Jamaica? I'll give you a treat. Okay, so it's that little one in the middle that says Taino. It's kind of, you see where it says Taino right in the middle. And that, pardon me? Right over to the left side there. Under Cuba, yeah. So we're like 90 miles away from Cuba. And so that signifies that that's all Taino territory. And Taino, it's, you know, there's debates about whether or not we called ourselves that. Many years ago, people called us Arawaks, but that's the family, that's the name, that's the language is Arawak. So it's from the Arawak language family. So it signifies that that whole territory is indigenous territory, and all the other places you see there. So there's Cuba, there's Puerto Rico, Dominica, Haiti, and so on. Those are all indigenous territory. So the Taino people were the first to have contact with Europeans. That's when everything started, and that explains a lot of things we see here in Canada today, the residential school system. It was during the age of exploration, and we were the first to have that happen. So a little bit about me, because you know, when I was always told that when you do research, you should always start with yourself before you look, and especially when you're talking about issues of identity and education, it's very, very personal. So my mother's father and my mother were both Taino people. It took me a really long time to talk about it publicly with others, a very long time. For years, I would never stand up and even identify as being Taino. Well, I've written about issues of identity before, but it was not until more recently that I publicly talk about being Taino and my Taino ancestry. Because I do it now because I feel like it's the right time. It's all about timing, and the time is right. So when I visited my community or a community, someone told me that you have our bloodline and you need to carry on because we as Taino people, we're still here. So we've had to do a lot of proving that we still exist, and that you'll see why that's the case. So being Taino, it comes with having a lot of responsibility. And sharing with you about being Taino and indigeneity within Caribbean context is very historical, it's very personal, it's also very, very spiritual. And it's about representation. You look at the history books, you look at text, and issues of representation pops up. It's about providing visibility and voice, as Walshaw puts it. So the islands, all those islands have a very, very complex history. And scholars who do work in the Caribbean tells us that it's a painful truth that indigenous peoples in the Caribbean experience destruction. And of course, this is true. We're talking about major disruption and collision where our ways of life were ruptured as a result of Columbus and his voyages and all that stuff. And so we were here before 1492, and we're still here in 2017. Regardless of that disruption, indigenous people, we still play a significant role throughout the islands, although very, very invisible. So when we look at that history, it's not just black and white. For a lot of people, they think it's just literally black and white. And again, scholars who have done work in the field, like Wilson, talks about indigenous cultural continuity, that it is very complex. Carrying on with cultural continuity is complex, and it's multi-layered. Because there's so much historical processes, 500 plus years. So it's difficult to make conclusions or draw conclusions that Taino people don't exist or indigenous people do not exist in that part of the world. A lot of people in Canada will say it all started in 1492. Very, very few people acknowledge the Taino people who bear the brunt of Euro colonization since that very moment in 1492. First, I think it was Bahamas, and then shortly after it was Hispaniola, which is Dominican Republic, and Haiti, which is where Columbus went after he made a short visit to the Bahamas, and it all started there. That's when so much so that people think that those indigenous people are extinct. So you really see the level of mayhem and destruction that has caused over this long period of time. So with 500 plus years, we can't make conclusions, as I said, that indigenous people no longer exist in these regions or that they play no part in the contemporary Caribbean world. Indigenous people in the Caribbean have played a crucial part in these historical processes, and because of that, today they're indigenous people, and I just love to say, they're all over the place. They're all over the place. People look at me, what do you mean they're all over the place? They're usually very surprised, and when I say all over the place, I say they're all over the place here too, because that whole idea of indigenous people being the vanishing Indian is right throughout the Americas, actually. So I think that it's important that we include our own narrative, and I think it's important when we do research. Researchers include their own narrative because everyone has their own story. And indigenous peoples, many are actually officially recognized within the Caribbean. So for example, the Caribs are recognized within St. Vincent, Trinidad has the Santa Rosa Caribs, which the government, I don't know if they promised to give some land and they've had their own settlement. Dominica is the only place in the, not Dominican Republic, but Dominica is the only place in the Caribbean which actually has a reserve like we do here. And there's 3,000 people that live on reserve. They're actually, so the reason it's called Caribbean is after the Caribs, but the name they call themselves is Kalinago. And Belize as well. Belize has a lot of Maya people and Garifuna people. The Garifuna people are similar to Métis people here, so they're a mix of Kalinago people and Black Africans that were brought over to that territory. So they have their own language, culture, and so on. And a lot of Garifuna people are in Belize and Honduras and other places. There's also indigenous people in Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti. They have a very, very rich history, actually, of Taino people. So there's a movement, and there's a movement globally, and there's interactions that has shaped and helped to shape and produce what we have here today. So they're one of the Taino are one of the major, they're not the only ones, but they're one of the major groups of First Nations people throughout the Caribbean region, most of the Greater Antilles and some parts of the Lesser Antilles. So again, they were the first to have contact with outsiders. And when you look back before 1492, because everything seems as if nothing existed prior to that time, they were living on these islands that you see there for generations, long before Columbus came in 1492. The Spanish came and other newcomers. And they were living in their own well-developed and organized societies. So some scholars say, you'll see all kinds of numbers out there. 8 to 10 million of Taino people living in the Greater Antilles. Approximately 1 million, some scholars say, lived in Jamaica at the time. And in fact, speaking about indigenous people throughout the Americas, so in general, or you may have heard the name Turtle Island is what some indigenous people, the Anishinaabe people, call the Americas: South America, Central America, North America. And Talhousie states that at the time of contact, speaking about indigenous people in general, not in a Caribbean context here, that at the time of contact, there were 500 distinct nations living on Turtle Island. Imagine that, 500 different distinct nations. Each had their own environments. In fact, the 500 nations, they coexisted. She points out that they coexisted. They created technology. And you know, when I was in my community, I was given, don't ask me how I got it through customs. I think now, my goodness, how did that happen? I think the ancestors were protecting me because I brought stuff that, it was given to me. It's what they call pre-Columbian, and it's Taino technology. I wrapped it in my suitcase, I wrapped it in my clothes, put it in my suitcase, and I brought it here absolutely no problem. And I'm like, whoa, that's great. I was able to bring this. If I got in trouble, that would have been another story. 500 nations in, imagine Canada, the land that we're on, or what's now called Canada. 500 nations were coexisting. They were creating technologies that we could see, that we can't see, that housed them, that fed them, that entertained them. And they organized, and they were also geographically diverse. So you have indigenous people in the plains, in California, in the Caribbean, in South America, and so on. So we're talking a lot of diverse people here, a lot of different languages and cultures. So back to the Taino population, we have historically Taino people, high population in Puerto Rico. Borican is the Taino word for Puerto Rico. We have a high population in Cuba and also Jamaica. So no matter what the numbers are, you will see different numbers. People will say different things, but no matter what the numbers reflect, the point is that these places that you see on this map, it's all indigenous territory, and that's a fact. So, and it's all indigenous land. So that world existed long before Columbus. We had a life back then, and we still do today. So there was a history there. So I want to just share a little bit of history with what things looked like before 1492. All people have elements of culture, one of which is how they view their world, their worldviews, their philosophies, and so on, their beliefs. So having respect, traditionally, in Taino culture, and having good relationships with each other is a very, very important part of our traditional life. And there's a resurgence, and that's coming back. So we have our origin stories, creation stories. We have tons of creation stories. Which our creation stories reflects who we are, and it reflects our philosophies. So I'd like to share a little bit of a creation story with you. And just like in Canadian context, the Canadian government had all kinds of people, anthropologists, ethnologists, doing studies because they thought that Indigenous people here in Canada were going to die out. So they were doing language, documenting the language, documenting things about the culture from their perspective. The same thing happened with the Taino people. And so Columbus got Raymond Fryer, a priest, to document Taino culture, aspects of Taino language, and so on. And I really like this story. This is about the origin of the Caribbean seas. It's very long. My whole keynote would be on it so I just pull a short excerpt. So Yaya, the great creator, kills his son Yael, whom he loves, but at the same time he fears. He thinks he fears his son may replace him. So Yaya puts the bones in a gourd that he hangs on the roof of his house. But he also misses his son and asks his wife to take down the gourd so he can see his son Yayo again. They find that the bones have become large and small fish, and they decide to eat this fish to sustain themselves. Deminin and his 3 brothers went to Yaya's house. The 4 are quadruplets, 2 sets of twins. They were born to Itiba. She died before they were born, and they were cut from her womb. The brothers walked on the clouds and over the blue skies of the Caribbean. They visit Yaya's house in his absence, and they saw the gourd hanging from the roof. So then they began to eat the fish from the gourd, and then they try to hang it up when they hear Yaya coming back home. They fumble, and the gourd falls to the earth. It breaks, and when it breaks, it lets out enough water and fish to create the Caribbean seas and oceans. The brothers use the 2 halves of the gourd as canoes, and they travel across the waters. They use the shells of turtle to create islands, clay and stars to create men, and manatee to create women. Can I have the other slide? Okay, and then just can you go to the next one? I think I have, there's the manatee. The manatee to create women. Some also say that Deminan had a children with a sea turtle, and these became the first human beings. So that's just a small excerpt of one of our creation stories about how the Caribbean came to be, how the Caribbean Sea and oceans came to be, and how the first human beings came to be. And Turtle Woman is the ancestral mother. And so for Taino people, it's matrilineal, and we trace our kingship relationship through her. The Taino creation story also identified the gourd as a source of life, a vessel of life. And don't even get me started about the gourd. I absolutely love it because it's so special to us as Taino people. You know, when I was small, we used to go in the bush and we would pick gourd. And I actually did I brought up a gourd as well in my suitcase, but it has turned very dry. And the gourd is a beautiful thing. It's very important to us. It doesn't matter what the weather is. It keeps your food very cool. So back in the day, when that was like the refrigerator for Taino people, the gourd. The inside of the gourd also has medicines. So when you cut it open, you could use it for various things, you know, to heal various ailments that somebody might have. The manatee, the creation story talks about the manatee. The manatee is beautiful. The manatee is to the Taino what the buffalo is to the Plains people. It's very sacred. And our Taino story also talk about the fish. Fish have been in our community for hundreds and hundreds of years. Depending on the region that you live, some Taino people also have creation stories about caves, you know, that the first human beings emerged from caves. And in the Jamaican context, there's a lot of creation stories around caves and how people emerge from the caves. So it's a very, very significant, the caves are a significant spiritual source. It's a source of sanctuary for Taino people, and it has been used traditionally as a sanctuary. So there's creation stories about, you know, the fish and other things like with the story with Yaya, and there's also other creation stories that centers around caves. Okay, so can we go back, Jenny, to slide 2? Yes. So just to give you a little bit, so I went to Jamaica, and I heard that there was a Taino museum. So I'm really ready now to go and see how their things are represented, because I grew up there hearing that we were dead, extinct. Sorry about that. So I went to this place and I saw this. We finally got there, and when we went there, it's supposed to be the museum, but it was empty. So then we heard that all the things had been removed because it wasn't in a good area. Yeah, put Taino Museum in not in a good area, so who's gonna visit? That's what I heard anyways from people in that community. But anyways, I really felt something when I was there, and I took a lot of pictures, so I wanted to share that with you. That was in 2013, so I'm not sure if that building is still there, but at least I have my pictures. So thanks, Jenny. So can we go back to the manatee? Okay, thank you. So Taino people also had economic systems before 1492. They were skilled agriculturalists. In fact, we're still skilled agriculturalists, and that legacy remains today, because where I'm from, we're considered the breadbasket of the island, meaning there's a lot of farmers that produce produce that feeds the whole island. And so in my village, it's a fishing village, and fishing is a way of life. I have cousins and grandfathers that go way back fishing, where they would go out to the Keys for weeks and months. And so we rely heavily on fishing, using some of those same techniques that they used historically. And there was a widespread trading network, believe it or not. So when you see, I don't know if anyone has seen Pirates of the Caribbean. Has anyone seen it? So as you know, there's a lot of distortion, right? There's untruths and distortions. And we read that the Kalinago people are cannibals, and that the Tainos were just these wonderful people who were, and yes, we are, I'm sure, but again, the distortion that the Kalinago people are cannibals and very fierce, and that they were always fighting with the Taino, is what you will find in history books, and that's not true. There were a widespread trading network among the various islands, and so the movements of the Caribbean did not happen in 1492. There were movements before then. So Taino people traded with other nations all over the islands, and they traded with the Kalinago people. They constantly visited each other, and the records show that before 1492. So in fact, they're our relatives, the Kalinago people. They're our cousins. I've even heard of trading here in Canadian context between the Taino people and the Mohawk people here in Canada. So can we go to the next? I forgot about this. Okay, so when I talked about being skilled agriculturalist, and I'm going to talk about this. Anyone familiar with this? You're familiar with it? What do you guys call it?
In Bengali, I guess they put it into the yam, I guess.
Yeah, so depending on where you're from, it has different names, but this is the main sustenance for Taino people. It doesn't matter where you are, what country you are in the islands. Cassava has fed them and nourished them, and cassava is very, very important. So I just wanted to point that out. It's called yuca for some, and we call it cassava. Thank you. Can you go to the next one? So, oh, I love that. We have a lot of those trees in our community, and that's called a ceiba tree, or silk cotton tree. And the Taino people, in fact, the word canoe comes from the Arawak language family. It's a Taino word. And the Taino people were skilled at navigating the seas. And so when I hear stories that they traded and traveled with each other, it does not come as a surprise. So they were skilled at navigating the sea, skilled at using canoes for transportation. And this is what we make our canoes from, that tree trunk you see there. So, and there's still a lot in our community. Many of these trees are in my community, and they're considered sacred to the Taino people. And what I've heard is that they're also considered sacred to the Africans who later arrived on the island. So that's a very important tree. There's a lot of stories that centered around the ceiba tree, a lot of stories. So in our community, we still rely on fishing. From back then until today, we still rely on fishing, except for one thing. Community tourism has come into play. We're still skilled at agriculture. So in addition to our economic systems that I've described, we also have social structures, because all cultures have that in place. And so Taino society was structured based on, the structures represent the worldviews that we have as a people. Both men and women could be chiefs, so you had female chiefs as well. Both men and women worked as farmers, but cassava, that yam, was prepared by women, and it still is today. Well, I grew up seeing my mother preparing it. She grew up seeing her grandmother preparing it, and it's a whole process. You might know that that can poison you, right? Do you know that? So there's the bitter one, and there's a sweet one, and there's a certain technique and way of preparing it to make sure that you don't kill yourself, right? Is that, yeah, so there's certain skill in preparing it. So cassava was prepared by women, and I still see that tradition today. And no matter, like I said, where Taino people are, it's a main staple, and it's a way of life. Women were the driving force in Taino society. And in that culture, there'll be no need for women's rights because it was embedded in our culture. As you see from our creation story, it's matrilineal. Also, we also had systems of governance. Although different roles, people had different roles, everyone was seen as interdependent of each other and equally important. When it comes to education, it was a lot like Indigenous people today in Canada. Children learn by watching, observing, experience, and so on. And that continues today. Children also learn by ceremonies. We have ceremonies called Erito, and that's practiced all over Puerto Rico. It's kind of like, it's sacred, it's a ceremony. So there's a lot of resurgence of that has always been around. And that's a formal, structured way of educating children by having them involved in ceremonies. So this is just a little brief snapshot of life before Taino, 1492. And when Columbus came to Jamaica, he laid claim to the island. So he came in 1494, 2 years after he arrived in Haiti. And as soon as he arrived on the island, he laid claim to the island for Spain. By 1509, you had massive settlement. And the arrival of Columbus came with other Europeans, and that changed everything. It brought harsh, drastic changes, rapid changes that fractured Taino people's structures, their ways of life. They started building mines, commercial agriculture came into place, people were enslaved, people were kidnapped and taken back to Europe as proof that they had reached the New World. Of course, new to them, but old to us. And Canadian scholar, Indigenous scholar, Wesley Esquimalt tells us that contact with colonizers changed everything for Indigenous people. Can I have the next slide, please, Jenny? So that's, the impact is very drastic. And I still feel and see the impact today. In fact, in the Caribbean, because they've been seen as extinct, people have not dealt with these kind of trauma at all. And it's one of the reasons that it explains some of the why things are the way they are today. So traditional social structures and alliances and kingship ties were disrupted. Also, disease led to many of our people becoming very ill and eventually dying with Columbus and his quest for gold. So it was very, very catastrophic. There's no doubt. There's no other way to put it. Major disruption happened, and we were written out of history. Can I have the next slide, please? We were written out of history. You have the history books, the school text, even in Canadian context, because last year during Columbus Day, my son who is in school here told me that we learned about the Taino, and he was so happy. And I was happy too, except that he learned that they were dead. Meanwhile, he's at the school. So that's, again, the distortion. So here's just an idea of how the text, what the books tells us. 500 years plus of hearing that we're dead. By 1519, remember he came in 1494. By 1519, the Indians of Jamaica were nearly extinct. Again, another quote, in less than 20 years, the impending extinction of the natives were apparent, and in another 10, it had occurred. But these are master narratives. And as the colonial documents like these declared us extinct, what happened was people found ways to survive. And just to give you an example, in Spanish Caribbean, like Puerto Rico and places like that, when they colonized some of the islands, it was predominantly men, of course, that initially came, and they had marriages with local Taino women. But it was the women who passed the culture, who passed the traditions on, down to their children. So the culture remained. And so when you engage in this type of work, for me as a person who's Taino, it's like moving from the bodily experience, move away from that master narrative, that colonial violence, to dancing my way back to freedom. So as I'm standing here with you today and I'm sharing this, that's what I'm doing. I'm dancing my way back to freedom. So when I do this type of research on issues of identity and indigeneity, this type of what I call decolonizing research, because it's part of the decolonization process, is experiential, is knowledge, honoring experiential knowledges that's embodied in my own personal and collective history and that of my community. Now, Clea Rodriguez tells us that we must listen to the silences, that which is not written, and pay attention to the internal dynamics of communities and how we label their experience if we're truly committed to the work of decolonizing. And I think that quote speaks to what you said this morning, Jenny. When I did my research in 2013, an elder from my community told me that, and I love it. She says, Taino people are important. You can't kill out a people like that. Columbus could not come here and kill out Taino people. And then she said, too much Taino for him, in that tone. And I absolutely love that. So it was also very powerful to hear that, right, on the ancestral territory, to hear somebody say that. Another noted, how can the people gone and the plant and land is still there? Again, for us, land is extremely important. It's wrapped into our identity, and there's no disconnect. So when I go home and I see land and I ask my mom, who owns this land? She starts to name like 15 people, and I'm like, Mom, no, please, who has the title for this land? And she says, it's for everyone in the community. So there's still communal use in our community, and that's part of who we are. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the land was taken away. And there's a lot of things that I cannot share with you because it's not the right time, that I found in my research as well. So that's part of who we are. A lot of land was taken, and today, while there's the notion of private ownership, it was introduced and it still exists in our community. A lot of times, even though there's private land, people still use it communally. So the land base, we still, and although we have had and still continue to have our land taken away, because as I said earlier, right away as Columbus got there, he laid claim to the island. Then after the Spanish left, the British came, and they laid claim to the island. And I've heard stories in my research how different people were coming from England. That's after the Spanish had no more use for the land, the English decided, okay, we're gonna take it. And that's how we ended up speaking English, but Spanish is a second language. So people were forced to give up their land. It brought starvation. Everything I've shared with you about colonization and that history brought so much starvation that my mother and other elders who are elders who are in their 80s and 70s tell me stories about when they were small, how people would come from England and they would take that land, and people were forced to give up their land because they were starving for a bag of potato. So structures were broken down and so on. Can I see the next slide, please, Jenny? So this is me in my research, and this land is actually, I'm hoping that this one will just work on its own. So this land that you see here, this exact land is where my ancestors walked. They walked this land. And this knowledge holder. So I went into the community, and I had 3 elders with me, all in their 80s. And I saw this man, and I asked him, I said, I'm looking for somebody to travel, to go into the land with me, to walk the land with me. And he said, come back tomorrow at 4. So I went back the next day at 4, and he had another person with him. And so we went, but these are lands that I pretty much walked and knew every single medicine when I was like 3 and 4. But I needed somebody to go back with me in 2013 because I'm sort of like an outsider, insider, outsider. So he's a knowledge holder. He shared with me that his wife is Taino. And in fact, he told me, my father-in-law is Taino, and he has a lot of stories that he'll be happy to share with you. So we were just talking, and we were going through that land. But that land, I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So we were walking the land, and I think that we're still connected to our land. We still have land-based practices, and this is what I think that some indigenous people call walking the land. This is what the elder meant by saying, how can the people be gone and the plant and land is still there? All that plant and land was there when the Spanish came. And this is where our ancestors were, literally on this exact land where I'm standing on. This is where they were chased by the Spaniards, women with children. And he told me that what happened was they would run and they would hide from the Spanish, but what got them were the dogs. They would bring in the Mastiff dogs. And that's horrific. We don't have dogs, we didn't have dogs originally. We had very small animals, hutia. And so they would snatch the babies from the mother, the dogs. And later, there's all kinds of caves around there that have pictographs and rock paintings and so on. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's that land that you see there that reminds me how to be Taino, and I'm very connected to it even though I've left. So if you could kindly bring in the other slide. So this is part of that land. The sea is right there. And as I said earlier, it's that same sea that they go out on when they're fishing. And then you see them till you no longer see them, the men that go out fishing in our community. So when I say land, I'm talking about the sky that you see there, that water, the trees, and that body of water in the sky. And so we relied on that land for food. This exact same land, there's so many different cacti over there. There's like 8 different in that small piece of land. Different, variations of cacti. There's tons of medicine. The mountains teaching us the hills, it nourishes us, and it's part of our land ethics. We have a great respect for the land and the sea. And so there's a reciprocal relationship there traditionally and still is today. We still have what I call our long-time ways or ancestral ways, and it's that ways that sustain us. So walking these lands, and it's about having a strong sense of community. So Taino peoples, their governance traditionally and even today is centered around things like farming, fishing, that land that you see there. And it requires a special relationship going out on this land and going out fishing, going away for days. So when the Spanish came, many of those people that were there resisted, and they also brought Africans as chattel slaves. People fled to the hills. People fled to areas that were not accessible, that the Spanish didn't know about, and they fled to those areas and they hid. So by 1518, there were contracts going on where they had a huge annual supply of slave labor. So they were bringing a lot of people as slaves to the island. And Taino people that were there, they resisted, they fought back. In fact, the Taino people in another part of the island fought off Columbus and his men. And they fled to less accessible areas. And can we bring in another slide? So all that area, imagine how it was over 500 plus years. And it's pretty rough right now. It's actually quite rugged terrain. So they hid in these areas, and my ancestors hid in this exact area that you see here, piece of land. And again, I mentioned the dogs. The dogs chased them on this exact piece of land. And can we see another slide? So again, I talked about the cave, and this cave is very, very significant. So that I went back the next day, and the 2 knowledge keepers, and oh my God, these guys, if I tell you how much knowledge these guys have that you won't see in textbooks. And they're very, very humble, and they were so willing to share with me. As I was talking to them, the person in the white hat, he started telling me about Taino people from nearby villages, and he said, for example, there's this lady over in that village, her name is Myrtle. She's Taino. I'm like, oh yeah, that's my mom's sister. So that was really funny how he's telling me names, and a lot of them are related to me. So, but this cave is significant. In 1900, archaeologists found 2 skulls in this cave. One was, and of course they did testing, one was of a full-blooded Taino, is what I heard. This is exactly in 1900, that's what the research records show. And a male, one was about 20 years old, a female of African and Taino ancestry. Both were found in the cave, and of course it was taken to the museum. They did testing on, I don't know actually where it is today. It might be in Europe, might be in England. The bodies of the ancestors, I'm not sure, because a lot of Taino also used the caves as a burial site. But this is where they fled for sanctuary when the Spanish came with their dogs. And I went into this cave. Don't ask me how I did it. I don't even know what I was doing. I went in this cave, and it's those men kept saying, oh, this is beautiful. And I was on my stomach, and I was literally crawling in the cave. And it's almost like there's a living room area where you could sit and eat. And then if you look down, there's a huge drop. And, but we stayed in there for a while. There was a lot of bats. And there's a lot of stories about bats and tainos in caves as well, lots. But this, like other caves across the island, and there's many caves, have rock paintings, and we are oral culture like a lot of indigenous culture, but the rock paintings tell stories that, there's stories there. And it was a form of writing and a form of art. So the Taino origin of humans also view caves with great importance, and there's many examples of these recording of stories and events in this very cave here, and rock paintings. Caves were also used for burials, as I pointed out, and as a place for sanctuary before Columbus and even during Columbus, because those men told me that once they got in the cave, they were okay when they tried to flee away. Is that a word? Fled or flee or something? From the Spaniards, from the Spanish. Once they got in the cave, because the dogs didn't go in the cave and they didn't go in the cave, so they were safe. One community person told me that we had fruits and springs to get water, to continue to live our lives. And that's one way that we ensure that we survive. So again, you have this narrative of extinction of the Taino people. And you can really see over 500 plus years how this is all systemic. It was intentionally designed because we were written throughout many Caribbean islands out of the census. But there's lots of paradox as well, because even when you look at some colonial records, they show that people have survived. And some records show our existence on the island even in 1655, if you remember those quotes I read earlier. And that was after the British came. So when you look at the documents that were written from the colonizer's perspective, they start to perpetuate this rumor that these groups of indigenous people are dead. And it becomes part of the historical narrative which continues to exist today. But people in community know otherwise. And the knowledge holder, like I said, these people know a lot. One record when I did my research shows that a man by the name of Thomas Manning in 1710, he was identified as an Indian by the name of Tom, but Indians from India did not arrive on the island till 1845. And my grandfather and my grandmother both were Taino, and they talk about being Taino, but they only talk about being Taino within the family, never out of it. And both were coming from a long line of Taino people. And our land that we lived on for hundreds of years is there. It's passed down through the family. It's been documented. The government knows that we still exist. The good thing is they have neither, they're not denying our existence, and that's a good thing. They know. So the research also shows that a boy was sold as a slave in 1793. His racial designation was Indian and black, which they used the term griff. So another girl was identified as Griff, and she was sold as late as 1816. So throughout my life in schools everywhere, this myth is perpetuated, it's produced, and it's maintained. So even being, talking about indigeneity in the Caribbean and my own Taino background is an act of decolonization, it's an act of resistance. And we have to ask ourselves when we do our research, whose knowledge is centered? When we think about knowledge production, whose knowledge, even in academic settings like this, whose knowledge is considered valid? And so, again, when you have to know when to identify. And sometimes for us, it's safer to not and to be non-existent. Because throughout the Caribbean, Taino's identity was shaped and is influenced highly by Euro domination. And so today, when I even talk about being Taino, there's people that lash out. There's people that are extremely angry as if I killed someone for them. They don't want to know that we still exist. And so a lot of people who are Taino still continue to remain quiet. I was one of the first people to publicly talk about being Taino on the island, and people were shocked. They were coming up to me. Other Jamaicans were coming up to me, and they were asking, Everyone knows that where I'm from is Taino territory. That's a given. But no one has ever publicly said it, even though they know who they are. They've never come out. So it was very historic. And so Taino identity was shaped and influenced by Euro domination. For example, in places where, Spanish-speaking Caribbean, where they introduced the encomienda system, which is a form of control, they kind of decide who's Indian, status, who's Indian and all that. In some of those islands, if you were mixed, you were protected by a law, by their law. So that resulted in a lot of Taino people marrying out to protect themselves and to ensure their survival. So Tainos were legally written out of the census as well. And if you're a Taino, you would click something else. So clearly I'm mixed with African and Taino. But my whole life I've denied that, or just never, I think not being able to speak about it publicly is a form of denial. And so you would click something else, you click black or whatever they have on the census, or back in the day when they had colored or something like that. So some of these policies that I'm speaking about is not new. They also occurred in North America context as well, and a lot of indigenous scholars call it paper genocide, written out of history. So because we've been written out of history, we're writing ourselves back in, and that support and nurture, we're nurturing our indigenous knowledges, and we're reconstructing our indigenous voice within the research discourse. And so we found ways to adapt, we found ways to adjust to the situations that we found ourselves in. And that meant that you don't talk about it too much. You try to fit in with the dominant society. And so people mostly think that most people in Jamaica are Black African, and that's true, but it's also not true. It's very, very diverse. Most people on the island, a lot of people on the island, if they're not mixed with Taino, they're mixed with whites because there's a long relationship there. And in fact, the island, how do you say, motto that they have is out of many one people, and on it is a Taino woman and a Taino man. So that is why I mentioned earlier that being Taino comes with a lot of responsibility, because you have to carry on with cultural continuity. You can't really go by what the textbook says, because we know who we are. So can you bring in that final slide for me, please, Jenny? I think it's the final slide. So this is very interesting. I got a call a couple of years ago from the Smithsonian Museum of American Indian, and they said, here's a grandpa. He's from your community. This picture was in 1892. He's identified as an Indian, Taino Indian. Do you know him? Do you know his family? Well, it's 1890, but when you're in community, everybody knows everybody, even if it goes way back, once you know their last name. So I know his last name, and I've not been back there since I got this picture, but I guarantee you, this is in somebody's album. This is in somebody's living room. It's there somewhere. I don't know him. I don't know I know the family name, but I don't know. I'm gonna go to various people and they'll tell me. I'll find out real quick, real soon. I'll have some idea which family he came from. But I think it was very courageous of him in 1892 to identify as Taino. So these are the contradictions when you're hearing that you're extinct. And ironically, for this picture to end up in the Smithsonian and then to come back to me, it is coming around, that resurgence is coming back. So that myth of extinction has been passed down through the centuries, and it has remained dominant. So when you look at that dominant construction of indigenous people in the region, the Caribbean, my research, it gives priority to the worldviews of the researched. And again, part of the researched, the people who share, the research, so to speak, is also myself. Indigenous scholars note how indigenous people have been researched to death. And those of you who took the class with me last year, that was a dominant theme, right? Throughout the class, it's been repeated over and over by indigenous scholars. At the same time, being able to do this research, it provides a space to critically expose the ways in which the other, in this case, the Taino other, has been studied and theorized. But guess what? We're bringing it back. We're bringing it back from Taino perspectives. And in fact, when I did my research, one person told me, my father told me we're coming from the Taino bloodline and that we have been here for a long time. My father, she notes, insists that when people ask if we're Indian and we say yes, he said, you must always remember to tell them that you're Taino Indian. So as Taino people, we know who we are. Of course, our ancestors know who we are, and many others have had some knowledge of their background, and some are in the process of recovering their knowledge. Jose Barrero, who is a Cuban indigenous scholar, Taino scholar, says that Taino is movement. Remember I said we've been doing movements way before 1492. It's identity, it's ancestry. Another community person told me that although the history books tells us that our people have vanished, I know they will come back. Again, keep in mind that we didn't write these books, so there's time for rewriting, there's time for reconstructing. And people are no longer willing to sit back. There are formations of, there's tons of organizations, there's conferences that's dedicated to Taino history and life. 5 years ago, there's things that are happening today that would be unheard of 5 years ago. We're reclaiming our history. There's a reawakening of Taino pride and activism all over the place. And what we're doing really is rebuilding our nations. And we're rebuilding our nations, and in doing so, you know, since I've done this research, there's been a lot of recent developments in a very short time. I've had many people. I average at least 3 emails a week from people asking me, can you share with us? I know that the most recent email I got was from someone in Toronto who said that his great-great-grandmother was Taino, and he has a lot of stories that he would like to share with me, but he's asking me if I could help him to find out more about Taino. That's how much has been basically taken away from people who are Taino, that they really don't know who they are, and so people are trying to find out. So there's some of the recent developments is that the museum always say that we were extinct, and what I heard was last year or the year before, 2014, that they took that sign down that says we're extinct, the museum, which is a big deal, and that the existence of Taino people is more widely accepted now, even though there's still a lot of backlash. It's still more positive than it is negative, and it's celebrated. I get calls all the time to talk about Taino. You would never, ever, like, I don't do Latin American and Caribbean studies. I do indigenous education and indigenous scholarship, but it's all connected. And when you look at Latin American and Caribbean studies throughout Canada and even in the US, a lot of times indigenous people are very invisible within the Caribbean context. And I was really surprised the other day to see a tenure track position specifically looking at indigeneity in the Caribbean. So there's a lot of movements happening. That would be unheard of 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, or 7 years ago. So the existence of Taino people have been more widely accepted and celebrated, and this is leading to a new awareness in the school systems even of Caribbean indigenous people, and a new chapter in Taino life. So thank you for being so patient and for listening.